Hello everyone, welcome to lesson 3 of our AP language course. Now, just to very quickly recap, in lesson 1 we talked about some general ideas for the writing section, the essay section, the free response section of the test, and in lesson 2 we talked about the argument essay. In both of those lessons we talked about some concepts that apply to all three essays. We talked about thesis, commentary, evidence, claims, structure of an essay, things like that. If you do need refreshers on any of those, you can go back to those previous videos, get some refreshers there. A lot of those concepts are going to apply to what we talk about today as well, which is the rhetorical analysis essay. So here is an outline of what we are going to cover today. We have quite a bit of information to go over, a lot of concepts that we're going to talk about. We're going to start by talking about just an overview of the rhetorical analysis essay, what the prompt wants you to do, how you go about it, things like that. And we're also going to look over the rubric like we did with the argument essay last time. We are going to then transition to talking about rhetorical situations and strategies, how to identify rhetorical choices in the passage that you can then write about, things like that. Then we're going to talk about common ideas, purposes, or effects. You need to link the rhetorical choices that you write about in the rhetorical analysis essay together. They have to share some sort of purpose, some sort of effect. That's what that part of our lesson is going to be about, how to identify that and how to implement it into your essay. Then we are going to talk in depth about sophistication and style. We've mentioned it a lot in the first two lessons. We're finally going to get into more detail about how we can really earn that final point of the rubric, that sophistication point. And then we'll just end with a quick summary. That's the plan for today. Let's hop right into it. We will start by talking about the rhetorical analysis essay. So your task for the rhetorical analysis essay is to read a passage that's provided to you, identify the rhetorical strategies, devices, or choices used by the author of that passage or the speaker if it's a speech, and construct an essay that analyzes the effect of those choices. So you need to be able to not only write to do this, you also need to have strong reading skills as well. You need to be able to identify different rhetorical choices used by the author in the passage. And then once you've identified them, you need to analyze them. You need to explain what they do, what kind of effect they have, or what purpose the author has for using them. Something along those lines. You shouldn't explain what the passage is about, but rather how the author conveys their message. Rhetorical analysis is not, giving a summary of the passage. It's not saying, the author makes these points. It's not, I agree or disagree with the author. It is only about the techniques that the author uses to convey their ideas, the way that the passage is written. That's what your rhetorical analysis essay should focus on. So here's an example of what the prompt will look like, or at least the last part of the prompt. It tells you to do some specific things. It says your response should respond to the prompt with a thesis that analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices. So obviously respond to the prompt, thesis, that's something that's familiar to us. Analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices is important here, right? That's what your thesis should do. Your thesis should analyze rhetorical choices. You need to select and use evidence to support your line of reasoning. That's nothing new. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. Also nothing new. That's commentary. We talked about that last time. Your response should demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. That is something we are going to talk about. And your response should use appropriate grammar and punctuation in communicating your argument. That, again, is nothing that should be new to us. That should be kind of assumed. Anytime you're writing, you should be using appropriate grammar and punctuation. So your essay structure for the rhetorical analysis essay is going to be the same as it was for the argument essay, and spoiler alert, it's going to be the same for the synthesis essay as well. We have that 1-3-1 structure that we talked about in lesson 1. We start with an introduction, we have 3 body paragraphs and 1 conclusion. Again, the number of body paragraphs doesn't necessarily have to be 3. 3 is just the recommended number. Your introduction is going to introduce the topic and present the thesis statement. Your body paragraphs are going to present claims, evidence, and commentary. And your conclusion is going to tie everything back together. It's going to relate your claims and your evidence back to your thesis. This should all be review. This is all information that we've covered before. The rhetorical analysis essay structure is, at least in large part, the same as the argument essay, and the synthesis essay is going to be the same as well. The same structure applies to all three essay types. One difference, though, with the rhetorical analysis essay versus the argument essay is your thesis. And it's not drastically different, right? Your thesis is still achieving the same main goal. You still want to take a clear position, although it's not really a position in the rhetorical analysis essay, but you want to have a clear point that you can defend, right? But it's a little bit different. So your thesis should either clearly state what rhetorical choices you will be talking about and what the effect of those rhetorical choices are, or clearly state what the writer's message is and how he or she makes rhetorical choices to convey that message. Either way, regardless of kind of which of these two you use, your rhetorical analysis thesis needs to have the rhetorical choices that you're going to be discussing in the thesis, and it needs to have some mention of what the effect of those choices are or why those choices are made. Both of those things, both of those components need to be present in your thesis. This is something we'll talk a little bit about later when we talk about common purposes, ideas, and effects, but you should focus on one effect or message and choose 2 or 3 rhetorical choices that the author makes that all convey the same effect or message. So you shouldn't, you don't want to say the author uses metaphors to do this one thing and then uses symbolism to do this other thing. You want all your rhetorical choices to kind of focus around the same effect, the same idea, the same purpose. And we'll talk more about that later. If we look at this example down here, we can see a really strong thesis statement. It starts here. In the address he gave to dedicate the statue, Obama used repetition, biblical references, and personal anecdotes to convey the power of her actions. So we have repetition, biblical references, and personal anecdotes. Those are the 3 rhetorical choices that this student is going to be writing about in his or her essay. And then convey the power of her actions is the effect that all 3 of these choices do. All 3 of these choices help to convey the power of Rosa Parks' action. It's Rosa Parks that they're talking about, right? Yeah. So this is what a strong thesis statement looks like. It has all the rhetorical choices in it, and it has one common purpose or effect that they all achieve. Let's talk a little bit about how the rhetorical analysis differs from the argument essay. We already talked about the thesis, right? That's kind of one way that it differs. In addition to that, obviously the argument essay, you want to be persuasive. We talked about that in lesson 2. The rhetorical analysis essay, you don't necessarily need to be persuasive, right? You're not trying to persuade the audience that you're correct and someone else is incorrect, right? That your position is the right one and the other positions are wrong. You're more so trying to explain your point to them or explain a concept to them. You still want to be convincing, though. All right, persuasive and convincing are similar in some ways, but different in other ways. Persuasive is about getting people to agree with you, whereas convincing is about people believing what you say and thinking what you're saying is true. So you want to be convincing, but you don't necessarily need to be persuasive. And because of that difference, you don't need to focus on rhetorical appeals too much. You can still implement them, but it's not as important as the argument essay. You also don't need to address opposing viewpoints because there really aren't any opposing viewpoints. So that's not something you should do at all in the rhetorical analysis essay. Opposing viewpoints are strictly for the argument and synthesis essay. And you should still use strong, direct, and specific diction and syntax, right? Because strong, direct, and specific diction and syntax isn't just for persuasion. It can also help you be more convincing. It can also make your point stronger regardless of kind of what your purpose is. And another big difference, of course, is that you do not need to come up with your own evidence. All of the evidence will come from the passage. So because your thesis is going to be about these rhetorical choices, all of the evidence you need is going to come from the passage to talk about those rhetorical choices. The choices are from the passage, so obviously the passage is going to have the information you need to support your claims and your thesis. All right, so let's talk about the rubric. It is similar to the argument essay rubric in a lot of ways. The main categories are the same, right? Thesis, evidence and commentary, sophistication. The criteria does differ a little bit, though. So for the thesis, just like the argument essay, your thesis needs to respond to the prompt and present a defensible position. And as we already talked about, your thesis should specifically state which rhetorical choices the author uses and the effect of those choices, as that is what the prompt is asking you to discuss, right? The reason you need to include those things in your thesis is because in order to make it respond to the prompt, it needs to have those things because that's what the prompt is asking for. For evidence and commentary, again, very similar, but there is one important difference, one important kind of addition. And that is, in order to earn the maximum 4 points, you must discuss multiple rhetorical choices. That's something that is specifically mentioned in the rubric. Explains how multiple rhetorical choices in the passage contribute to the writer's argument, purpose, or message. If you only write about one, the best you can get is 3 points here. It says at least one rhetorical choice. So you need multiple in order to get all 4 points. There is a note here. At the bottom over here. To earn the 4th point in this row, the response may observe multiple instances of the same rhetorical choice if each instance further contributes to the argument, purpose, or message of the passage. So if you can find multiple instances of the same choice, right? Maybe it's metaphors. Maybe the author uses metaphors in multiple different places. In addressing those can still get you the 4th point because it is still multiple choices, right? Even though it's multiple instances of the same choice, you just have to make sure you're talking about more than just one thing. The recommendation here would be to do 3 and have each of your body paragraphs focus on one choice. But regardless of what you do, definitely has to be more than one choice that you analyze in your essay if you want to get all of the points, which you should. You should want to get all the points. And the rest of it is the same, right? Provide specific evidence to support all claims in a line of reasoning, consistently explains how the evidence supports a line of reasoning. That's the same as what we've already talked about. And sophistication. Sophistication point is, again, still the same. It's still open-ended. There's still multiple ways to get it. The ways that you would achieve it are pretty much the same as the argument essay, and they're also going to be pretty much the same as the synthesis essay, and we will talk about the different ways to satisfy this point, to earn this point, when we get to that in this lesson, towards the end of this lesson. So that's the rubric. Very similar to the argument essay, except for a couple of key differences that we pointed out. Now let's talk about rhetorical situations and strategies, because these are things that are important for writing this essay, right? The prompt asks you to analyze the writer's rhetorical choices, and it also asks you to demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. So in order to do that, we need to understand what those things mean, and how to demonstrate an understanding, or how to analyze the choices, or how to identify the choices. But yeah, in order to analyze them and to demonstrate an understanding, like the prompt asks us to do, we need to know how to identify them and how to do that. So let's talk about it. First of all, what is a rhetorical situation? In order to demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation, we have to know what it means. And essentially, the rhetorical situation is the set of circumstances in which a piece of writing exists. It's everything that kind of surrounds the writing, that influences the writing. And it's kind of broken up into 5 categories. You have the writer, purpose, audience, message, and context. Those are the 5 elements that define the rhetorical situation. The writer is the person who composed the text. So it's either the author, if it's a written work, or the speaker, if it's a speech. And characteristics about the writer are going to influence the way that the piece of writing is understood. His or her age, gender, race, location, opinions, experiences, and other factors can influence how a piece of writing is curated or presented, right? The writer may make different choices based on their age, based on their gender, based on their race, etc. To kind of use an extreme example, we can expect that there will be differences between how a modern-day United States citizen and how a British loyalist that was born in the 1700s would write about the American Revolution, right? Because of their different ages, their different locations, their different opinions, and their different experiences. Even if they're writing about the same topic, they're going to write about it in very specific ways, in very different ways. Right? Similar. We could say someone in the South versus someone in the North during the Civil War. They're going to write about the Civil War in different ways. So understanding the writer, understanding the writer's background, can help us understand why the text is written a certain way, what that person's biases may be or influences may be, and so on. The purpose is the author's reason for writing the text. So it's not, what motivated them to write the text. It's not what the text is about, but what they are trying to achieve, what they're trying to do. Are they trying to inform their audience? Are they trying to analyze something? Are they trying to persuade their audience? What is their purpose? And the purpose can influence the text as well, right? Because depending on your purpose, the writer's going to take a different approach to the way that they choose to write it. If they're trying to inform versus if they're trying to persuade, they might present information differently. If they're trying to persuade, they might use, rhetorical appeals, right? Or those other things we talked about in the previous lesson when we were talking about how we would persuade our audience. Versus if they're just trying to inform, they might be a lot more straightforward, like factual, right? Here's the facts, right? They don't need to appeal to emotion because they're not trying to persuade you to anything. They're just trying to give you the information. So the purpose can also influence the way that a text is presented and understood. The audience are the people that the text is written for, and the writer may make different choices based on who his or her audience is and what he or she thinks the audience is most likely to respond to. So if your audience is children, you will probably choose to write whatever you're writing in a different way than if you were writing about the same topic to adults, for example. The audience or the expected audience influences the way that a text will be written, and it influences the way that we can understand a text. The message is the point that the author is trying to make. It's essentially what are they saying, right? What are they trying to convey to me? And again, depending on what the author's message is, they may make different choices in how they construct the text. And finally, the context. The context is just everything that exists around a text. It's time period, location, background information, etc. If it was written in the United States in the early 1800s, okay, what else is going on during that time period, right? That's the context. It has a lot to do with time is kind of the biggest part of the context, but location is important as well. Basically, everything that's going on at the time that the text is composed is the context of it. Context could also be like, are they replying to someone else? Or maybe context could be something like, there is some other text that influenced the writer while they were writing this text, stuff like that. So all these 5 different components make up the rhetorical situation. They all tell us and give us information about why the text even exists, but also about why the text exists in a certain way, right? Because the way that a text exists will differ based on these 5. Now, how do we apply this to the rhetorical analysis essay? Well, the first step is identifying these things, right? How can we figure out who the writer is and information about them? How can we figure out what the context is? How can we figure out what the author's purpose is, or who the intended audience was, or what the message is? Well, information about the writer and context are always provided in the prompt. Every single time you will get information about the writer and context. They'll tell you, they'll usually give you brief background information on the writer, what their occupation was, if it's relevant, right? Things like that. And you always get some sort of time period. So these you can kind of consistently get just from the prompt immediately. Purpose, audience, and message can often be derived directly from the prompt as well. And not every single time, but a lot of the time. And if you can't, you may need to read into the passage to identify them, but they're not super complicated to find, right? Purpose, just think about, okay, what is the author trying to accomplish? What are they trying to achieve? Message is, I think, the easiest one to figure out, because if you can't figure out the author's message, they're not a very good author. They should be making their message abundantly clear to you. It's just, what is their main idea? What are they trying to convey? And then audience can also, the context can help with audience as well. But yeah, those can be found pretty easily, usually straight from the prompt, if not pretty quickly in the passage. Now, the prompt asks you to demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation, but the rhetorical situation itself is not what you should analyze in your essay, right? You're not going to write an essay about how the context influenced the way that the text was written. The prompt wants you to focus on rhetorical choices, not the rhetorical situation. However, understanding the rhetorical situation can help you understand the rhetorical choices, right? As we just mentioned, the rhetorical situation influences the choices that a writer makes. So if you understand the rhetorical situation, it'll be much easier to kind of discuss why different rhetorical choices were made in the passage and what the effect of those rhetorical choices were. So understanding the rhetorical situation first can make it a lot easier for us to understand the rhetorical choices and to analyze the rhetorical choices.